Hi folks, I have something a little bit different for this video. I've had some requests for me to talk a bit about the tarot, and so I thought I would give a very brief introduction to the first few cards of the major arcana of the Marseille tarot deck. This is an incredibly broad and deep topic. It is something I know a lot about, but I don't consider myself an expert, and I don't think I ever will. One of the things that draws me to the tarot is the fact that it always provides something new. It always gives something for you to learn from. Now, these types of mystical or occult things often send people, running for the hills. But I think even if you have a very scientific, straight-laced mindset, I still think that there's something you can get from having some sort of understanding of the tarot. Now, most people associate the tarot with divination or fortune-telling. I don't really use it in that capacity much. I mostly use it for meditation. Every once in a while, I will pull some cards and do some divination. But even when I do that, I never use it as a means to try and divine the future. Some people do, who I respect, but it's just not my cup of tea. I am more interested in using it as a tool for understanding human psychology, especially my own. One of the drawbacks of trying to use it to divine the future is not that it doesn't work. As a matter of fact, one of the drawbacks is that you can get some sort of manifest destiny where you get an idea of how things are going to play out, and then you get stuck into that. So that isn't necessarily useful whether it works or whether it doesn't. So I prefer using it as a means of meditation. Now, I am a bit of a purist. I really enjoy the Marseille tarot deck for a number of reasons. It is the oldest complete deck, meaning there are decks that are older, but we don't have, a reproduction of every single card. And, people have created new decks, and some of them are great, to each their own. But this one, it's older, and it's a lot harder to see the finger marks where people have put their own spin on it. So that's one of the reasons I like it. This particular deck that I like a lot it's a restoration done by Alejandro Jodorowsky and the Camoin family. It has a lot of color to it, more than just the industrial 4-print colors. It goes back to before they did that. A lot of people think that the 4-print is old, but really they were hand-painted, so they had more than just those 4 colors. But anyway, so I'm mostly going to deal with the first 4, let's say 5 cards, depending on how you organize them, which you'll understand why I put it that way in a second. There's lots of ways to organize the tarot into mandalas. The way I like to do it is this one right here. My wife actually got me this frame for my birthday this year. It has the major arcana of the tarot deck laid out in a mandala, which I think is a good way to organize them. There's different ways of organizing them, but I like this one for a number of reasons. Oh, and before we go on, obviously, I really concentrate on the major arcana. The minor arcana I will probably get into in a little more depth at some point in my life, but really I focus most of my meditation on the major arcana. The minor arcana are closer to what you would associate with a traditional card deck, but instead of, clubs, diamonds, spades, and hearts, you get cups, wands, swords, and pentacles. So I'm concentrating on the major arcana of the deck. Now, one thing that different systems do differently is where they place the Fool card, Le Mat. Now, the Fool card is different than all the other cards in that it doesn't have a number. And it looks a bit like another card that does not have a name, which people often call the Death card, but if you look at the bottom, you can see there's no name on it. So it's often called the Nameless Arcanum. Now, when we're setting up our tarot cards into a mandala, this brings the question of where we place the Fool card, because it's a 0 card and all the other cards have numbers. It's often placed at the beginning. Sometimes it's placed at the end. sometimes it's placed second to last, and there's a reason in Meditations on the Tarot that the author goes into for why the school that he comes from places it at the end. But I like this mandala, and here's why. I like it because the Fool card and the World card, they kind of bookend the rest of the cards. So the reason I like that is because the Fool, he has no number. He's not 0. He has no number. And so to some degree, he's outside of the system. You know, he's the prisoner for, well, prisoner's maybe not the right word because he's very free, but he's like that Patrick McGowan from the show The Prisoner saying, I am not a number. You know, he hasn't entered this system yet. And so I guess I'll start talking there. And that's what he really represents. And now, the word represents is tricky when we're talking about the tarot. And any symbols, but especially the tarot. Symbols don't mean just one thing. Especially symbolism like the tarot. They have multiple meanings. And so whenever someone says this means this and that's it, that's not the case. Now, on the other direction, it doesn't mean that they can mean whatever you want. You know, and this is kind of a tricky thing, that there is interpretation that comes into it, but there are obviously things that the cards don't mean. It's hard for me to think of them off the top of my head, but if somebody came and told me that certain cards meant certain things, I would really have to question this. In any case, the Fool card, he has potential. You know, he's not tied down by the system. He's off. He's set off on his own. Maybe he's left the system. Maybe he hasn't entered it yet. But he's not attached. He's not part of it. And so he has the potential. He has potential to do great things. He has a potential to really screw things up as well. It's that pure, raw energy. And there's a sense of love to it. And there's a sense of animal love to it. As you see the dog that's, on his behind kind of, that represents his kind of animal nature rising up. And there's beauty and there's folly in that. And we should be wary of that because, like I said, you have the potential to do good things with that. You have the potential to make a fool of yourself. You have a potential to become any one of these other cards and all the good and bad things that come along with them. So that's the Fool card. I'm going to try and I'll probably just make this explanation rather brief today. We'll see how it goes. But I really want to talk about the first 4 cards of the major arcana. And the reason why I want to just talk about those today is because to some extent they're almost a system unto themselves. There's lots of ways you can break these up. If you look at this mandala that I have, you can break up the first 10 cards, you can break up, into the second 10, you could, look at how the 1 card and the 11 card correspond and so on. There's lots of ways you can break it up. But this is a good place to start. And the reason why is because in occult literature, especially Western occult literature, there's something called the Quaternary. Okay? And in the Old Testament, it was the name of God. YHVH. I come from a Christian background, so I don't know Hebrew, but it's Yad. Anyway, each of these 4 cards also corresponds with not only, one of the letters and the name of God, but more importantly, the 4 phrases that really an occultist or a magician lives by. And these phrases are to dare, to know, to will, or to do, and finally, to be silent. Now, the magician represents to dare. The High Priestess represents to know. The Empress, to will or to do. And the Emperor, to be silent. Let's start with to dare. The magician dares. He picks up his trade. He's taken it upon himself to learn to do something that maybe somebody else wouldn't have tried to do. He's tried to learn a new skill or a new profession or done something that maybe even it requires a little bit of danger or, going out on your own, hawking your wares at a table. There's a bit of daring in it. And but more importantly, there's a skill to be learned. He's not, saying, well, I can't do that. He's taken it up and says, no, I'm going to try this. Now he's, in some ways, you see a bit of mastery in this because he's holding his tools very relaxed, and we can talk about that in a minute. In addition to that, there is a great degree of, he's a learner. He's willing to put in the time, and that's the only way you ever accomplish anything in life, is by taking the time to whatever it is, whether you're learning an instrument or a language or an art, a martial art, learning how to paint, how to swim, whatever it is, he's putting in the time. That's the most important thing that anybody who's ever learned anything will tell you. He does so with a degree of ease. Now, oftentimes we associate this ease with someone who's mastered things. So this card is a little, although it's something that represents someone who's beginning, there is an element of which it represents someone who has really honed their craft. And in a way, they go hand in hand. And he does so with fluidity. Now, one of the things I like about this particular incarnation of the card, as opposed to, let's say, the Rider-Waite, is he's holding everything very gently. He's not tense. He's holding his wand very carefully and with ease. And the same thing with what he has in his hand. He's not trying to rush it. He's not pushing too hard. He's daring in that he's decided to take this up, but he's not trying to force it. Like anything else, it's something that he's taking his time to pay attention to. And that, I think, is a very important skill that we all think about when we meditate generally, whether we're doing an Eastern form of meditation or we're doing a discursive form of meditation, like I'm suggesting you could do with the tarot, where you just focus on one image or one idea, and you really try and keep your mind on that idea. Instead of keeping your mind empty, keep your mind on that idea. If you find a good thread, you can follow it, but really try and come back to it and come back to it and come back to it after following those threads. Now, one thing that I found useful as just going through life, and particularly as a parent, there's a quality that is associated with the magician, or le bateleur. My French is bad, so I probably butchered that, which means the juggler. Now, there's the quality, the sense that comes along with it is the sense of touch. There's a sense by which you can learn things in different ways. You can learn things by having someone tell you, or you can learn by touch. You can learn by doing. And it's very interesting seeing people who've learned by doing. I think a juggler, or in this case a magician, juggler, is a good example of someone who has learned by touch. They've learned to some degree by trial and error, by doing it. Now, I think about this with my son. My son is a very stereotypical boy. He's 4 years old now, but he was moving across the floor when he was 5 months, which is rather early. He was crawling at 7, and he could climb before he could really walk, and he was walking just shy of a year. And the reason he was doing that is because he wanted to do things. He wanted to do things. He wanted that thing that was over there, and well, I'm gonna go get it. And so it was a sense of touch, and okay, that actually gets to the Wheel of Fortune, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'll panel that, and we'll come back to that later. But in any case, the magician, he learns by touch. And moving on, we can compare this to the High Priestess. Now we see the High Priestess, she is seated, right? She's seated in a chair. She has a book. And that's where her knowledge comes from. And again, the High Priestess, the words we associate with her from the four phrases that a occultist lives by is to know. And she knows by study. Now, this is different than the way the magician knows, and they're both valid forms of knowledge, but they're different. And to some degree, they pack in and out of each other, because we have, the High Priestess. She is able to learn great amount of things without experiencing them, and like anything, once we get into this duality, there are of the difference between these two things, which is another thing that gets expressed through the High Priestess. There's costs and benefits to each. Someone who's just learning by touch, like the magician, is maybe less able to learn by study and less likely to listen to somebody. Likewise, someone who's, learning from a book or learning from things that other people have learned might have more difficulty improvising or more difficulty learning things on their own and might be more comfortable getting things kind of packaged for them. Nevertheless, the High Priestess does represent this great knowledge. We see her in comparison to the magician. She is seated, whereas the magician is standing. As active, female as passive. I don't think I need to explain why this is, even though there are aspects of it that I obviously would disagree with it. Basic sexual mechanics, I think, is where that comes from. Yeah, so she is about knowing, and, she is very much, the words we associate with her are knowing. She's not only called the High Priestess, but actually what we see right here is La Papess, the Papist, not the High Priestess even, the Papist, the female pope. There are apocryphal stories and myths about a female pope at times, which you could probably look up if you wanted to. But the other thing we notice is that she is veiled. She has a kind of, she has kind of layers between her and the world, and in order to dive into these books, she has had to somewhat cloister herself, for better or worse. So moving on, we have the Empress. Now, the Empress, the words that go along with her are to will or to do. She's the one who gets shit done. I must admit, I often have a hard time drawing anything directly from this image. Sometimes the cards, I get more understanding when I look at them in concert with the cards around them. This is why I find the understanding of the quaternary, or not the quaternary necessarily, although I guess they all map onto each other. But this is why I find the understanding of the Hermetic phrases so useful, because it does kind of connect these and gives some sort of way to contextualize it with the other cards. And so her thing is to will. She is able, as the Empress, in order to get things done. Now, this goes along with the process of magic. So in the first card, we have mysticism. We have someone who has had the touch, who has touched something mystical that goes beyond their understanding. That is the magician. He is mysticism. Lots of people can have mystical experiences. Maybe you've had a mystical experience. That's a first step. And some people never move past that first step, and that's fine. But if you move a little further, you get to gnosis. Now, gnosis is knowledge. The root of the word is knowledge. Okay, I'm not going to get into the etymology because I don't have it in front of me, and to be honest, I'm riffing on this video. But it is about knowledge, and it's about a deep knowledge, not a knowledge maybe even that you read in a book like the High Priestess is reading, but a knowledge that you've gotten from having the mystical experience and then trying to translate it into the book. And it's one thing to be a mystic and have the experience, and that's great, but what can you learn from it? What information can you get from it? And so this is the process we're seeing at play here. We're seeing the process moving from mysticism, of having the mystical experience, to gnosis, and having an understanding of how to contextualize that mystical experience with other mystical experiences you've had, or perhaps mystical experiences other people have had. This is why reading occult literature and these things can be useful, because you realize, oh my goodness, I'm not crazy. This mystic had this experience and this is what they gleaned from it. Oh, now I understand. Now that you have this knowledge, you have this greater understanding, well, what do you do with it? Well, to dare, to know, to will. And then you come to actually applying that knowledge out in the world. And that's what the Empress represents. She has a more worldly character to her. She is, in some ways, beyond a queen even. She's the Empress. She has a crown and a scepter. And just sitting there, she is able to rule and to get things done. So the Empress represents the will. Right? And we have this eagle shield, which seems like it's It's about to fly off, as opposed to the High Priestess, where we have a little egg in the back where things are kind of incubating and the knowledge is kind of incubating. Whereas the Empress, we have this eagle that is on her shield that has sprang forth. And she rules. She rules with the scepter, much like the Emperor, her husband, who comes next. The words that go along with the Emperor are to be silent. You dare, you know, you will, and then you shut up about it, which I'm not doing right now. Now, is there a contradiction here? Yes and no. Yes, I mean, of course, there's a contradiction, but in order to understand things, we must deal with contradictions. And this is where the most fruit is gleaned from. And so the Emperor is the end of this process. You've dared to know. You've had the mystical experience somehow. And then you've contextualized it through study or referencing your own understanding. And then you've applied it, like the Empress, and actually use your understanding to have an influence on the world. And the Emperor, in contrast, is in the same way that YHVH, the H repeats itself. We see a repeating of this understanding here. You know, you've had the experience, you've sought to understand it, you've applied that understanding, and now that you've applied that understanding, you're looking at how that worked. So you're looking at how your applied knowledge worked out. You know, did those understandings you got from your mystical experiences, when you applied them, did they work out well or not? Did some of them work out well? Why'd they work out well? These types of things. It's a retrospective. And we see the words to be silent go along with the Emperor. And there's a reason for this. There's lots of reasons for this, of course. We all want to talk. We all want to tell what we know. And it's not that you're ever going to be silent about it. That would be silly. I mean, the most obvious example is, Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, talking about this. The way that can be said is not the way. Well, yeah, but Lao Tzu wrote the book, so he must have thought it was worth saying something, even if it can't be said. But it's more to remind you to refrain from speaking. Listen. A good ruler, which is what the Emperor is. Now, these cards, they all have negative and positive aspects that they reveal. But really, when we look at the Emperor, we see a ruler. We don't see a ruler he's not ruling by a sword. He has a scepter in his hand. The scepter represents his, kind of divine power. Now, I'm not going to get into a political thing about divine right of kings and monarchs and emperors and such, because that's not really what this is about. What I would like to note is that he is a model ruler in many ways. If you see, first of all, he is not ruling with the sword. He's not ruling by compelling people. He is ruling because he is a good ruler and people listen to him because he's a good ruler. Why is he a good ruler? Why do people listen to him? Well, if you look at his left hand, he's holding onto his belt. He's restrained. He's restraining himself. He's not excessive in what he does. He's not seated. He's not seated down. If you look, he's not seated. He's kind of half sitting. He's got one leg on the ground, the other crossed. It looks like he's about ready to get up and do something. But what that is not clear. He's also not inside. He's not sheltered from what his subjects experience. He is outside. There's stuff growing at his feet. And so he's able to command authority, and that's the thing. As someone I would roughly describe myself as an anarchist. I question authority, but I will admit there are times, especially as a father, I grapple with this, where authority is legitimate. And when authority is legitimate, it can and should be respected. Now, authority is too often abused. Too often people do not behave like the Emperor. The Emperor just rules with the word. He doesn't need to use violence to compel people. He's able to influence people just by the truth of his actions. And yet, most of the time, the words we associate with him are silence, because he's more about listening. He's more about listening to his subjects than dictating to them. That's a good turn of phrase, dictator. So this is the emperor. And again, we see the eagle, figure of royalty. There's more things we can go in depth into these images on. And if you do decide this is something you'd want to meditate on, each aspect of it has things you can meditate on. And there are many books that you can turn to get started on understanding these symbols. Because as much as you can just sit here and look at these symbols, it is good to read what has been written about them. Otherwise, you kind of just run the risk of, like the moon card, just kind of projecting your own thoughts and, preconceived notions onto them. And that is a problem. Again, what I really like about the tarot is that it is an open system. What I mean by that is it's not something I ever feel like I'm always going to know completely, even though I feel I have an understanding that allows me to navigate on it. It's not a closed system. It doesn't give out one specific ideology or stance, even though there are definitely themes and lessons that are, to my mind, very clear that it gives. It is not, it's open to new information coming into it. Problem with that is, one of the obvious criticisms of that is that anything that is used for divination and whatnot, it has the potential just to kind of, if abused or not understood properly, again, projecting your own thing onto it. And that is something to watch out for. And luckily, I think it's something that if you're mindful of it, it can learn that lesson from it. You can really keep yourself from getting stuck in those things. And that actually is where I would like to leave off, this idea of why use the tarot. And I think this is very important for people, especially very rationally minded people. We all like to think of ourselves as rational beings, and to some extent we are, but reason and rationality don't go all the way down. There is something inherently irrational, not just about human beings, but our existence and our the world. And so we can very easily get stuck in, like I said before, these closed systems that think they have all the logic and all the reason and all the answers. And there are different techniques for breaking out of that and showing yourself that no, don't think about it so rationally, because that has limits. Kant, Critique of Pure Reason, really, in my mind, dealt with this very well. You have antinomies where two rational arguments can be made for opposing sides of something, and well, where does that leave you? It leaves you at an impasse. It leaves you in a place where reason just isn't going to solve your problems. And this is a technique for not necessarily solving that problem entirely, but trying to gain more perspective outside of those strictly rational understandings. Yeah, and so I think that's where I'll leave you for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I had some requests for it. I have a video coming out soon that's a collaboration between myself and Douglas Lane. He got a bit swamped this month doing some work, so I had to push it to next month. And so I thought I would do this, and I hope people enjoy it. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you really like what I do, please consider donating to my Patreon. You can also support this channel by buying a tarot t-shirt. They feature the major arcana of the Marseille tarot deck that I've been talking about here. I'm Greg Belvedere. Remember, all generalizations are stupid, so never speak in absolutes. Thanks.